It was supposed to be just another weekend getaway, a chance to drink, laugh, and forget how cold their marriage had become. But by the time the sun rose over the Tennessee hills, only one of them would return. Ethan Ward had always been a man of control, sharp, articulate, and quietly ambitious. At 42, he was a successful financial consultant in Nashville, admired for his intelligence and steady composure. To colleagues, he was the kind of man who had it all: a lakefront house, a luxury car, and a beautiful wife who smiled for photographs at every company event. Her name was Claire. Claire Ward was 38, graceful and soft-spoken, the kind of woman who lit up a room without saying a word. She had once been an art teacher, but after her marriage to Ethan, her career faded into the background. Their life appeared polished, even enviable, but behind closed doors, it was crumbling. Ethan had grown distant. Nights stretched into silence, filled with half-finished conversations and the faint hum of his phone lighting up with messages from someone else. Claire wasn't blind to it. She knew about the woman, or maybe there were several by now. The whispers in the office, the lipstick on his collar once, the sudden, business trips that left her alone for days. Still, she stayed. Maybe out of habit, maybe out of hope that the man she once fell in love with was still in there somewhere. By early autumn, something in Claire had begun to break. Friends noticed she had lost weight, that her once bright eyes seemed dimmed by exhaustion. She confided to one of them, "He's not cruel, but he's gone. It's like living with a ghost who eats dinner beside you." Ethan, meanwhile, was already planning his escape, but not a divorce. He couldn't bear the thought of losing half of what he'd built, or watching his wealth divided by a judge. And there was another problem: image. To the world, Ethan was the picture of integrity. A divorce would expose him. A scandal would ruin him. So he came up with a different idea. Something final. When he suggested the weekend trip, just the two of them, a cabin near Lake Melrose where they could reconnect, Claire hesitated. But then she said yes. She wanted to believe him, to think that maybe this was the beginning of something new. He smiled, kissed her forehead, and told her to pack warm clothes. Inside his chest, the plan had already begun to unfold. On Friday afternoon, they loaded the car, her sketchbook, his fishing gear, a bottle of bourbon. The autumn air was crisp, the trees around the lake a symphony of red and gold. As they drove through the winding country roads, Claire looked out at the scenery and whispered, "It's beautiful here." Ethan nodded, his fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel. He had checked the weather, the route, the secluded area by the woods where cell service faded away. He'd even chosen the spot days earlier, a clearing near the old logging trail, where no one would hear a thing. To anyone watching them that evening, they might have looked like a couple rediscovering each other, two people laughing softly over a shared meal and a crackling fire. But behind Ethan's calm expression was something much darker. He poured the bourbon, raised his glass, and said, "To second chances." Claire smiled faintly, unaware that her own was running out. The cabin near Lake Melrose was quiet that night, surrounded by pines that whispered in the cool wind. Inside, the fire crackled, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Claire sat on the couch, sketching the faint outline of the lake as it shimmered under the moonlight. She loved the stillness, it reminded her of the summers before her life became a performance. Ethan was behind her, opening another bottle of bourbon. "Another glass?" he asked, voice light, friendly. "Too friendly." Claire hesitated. "I think I've had enough." He smiled, that slow, disarming smile that had once made her trust him completely. "Come on, it's just us. No phones, no schedules, no one to judge. Let's forget everything for a night." She gave in. It had been a long time since he'd looked at her that way, like she was still his wife, not an inconvenience. She took the glass, the burn of the drink warming her chest. An hour later, the table was cluttered with empty glasses, and Ethan's laughter had grown louder, more erratic. His words slurred, his movements clumsy. Claire, tipsy and tired, leaned back, watching him stumble over his own stories. For a moment, she almost believed this was genuine. Maybe the old Ethan was still there somewhere, buried under layers of resentment. But beneath the surface, he wasn't drunk at all. Every laugh, every stumble, every word was rehearsed. He waited until the right moment, when she stood to grab a blanket and turned her back to him. The gun was already in his hand, hidden beneath the flannel throw on the table. It was a small revolver, the kind he kept locked in the safe at home, for protection. He took a deep breath. The first shot echoed through the cabin, shattering the fragile peace. Claire gasped, spinning in confusion, her eyes wide. The pain was immediate, a white-hot burst near her shoulder as she collapsed to the floor. The room blurred around her, the fire, the wooden beams, the smell of smoke and gunpowder. "Ethan," she choked, barely able to move. What did you?" Another shot silenced her voice. For a long moment, there was only the sound of his breathing, heavy, uneven, almost panicked. Then he stepped closer, watching her body. Blood spread slowly beneath her, soaking into the wood. Her eyes fluttered once, then closed. He crouched beside her, his face blank. "I told you I couldn't lose everything," he whispered. "You never listened." Outside, the wind picked up, scattering leaves against the cabin door. Ethan wrapped her body in a blanket, careful not to leave a mess. He dragged her through the back door, toward the woods, his boots sinking into the damp soil. The moonlight followed him like a silent witness. He found the clearing, the same one he had chosen days before. The earth there was soft from recent rain, easy to dig. He worked quickly, his breath visible in the cold night air. By the time he was done, his hands were shaking, his clothes streaked with dirt. He laid her down, whispering, "I'm sorry, Claire. You should have just let go." Then he covered her, first with soil, then leaves, until there was no trace left but a faint mound among the trees. He stood for a long time, staring at it. The forest was silent, the only sound the rhythmic beating of his heart. For the first time in years, he felt free. By the time he returned to the cabin, the fire had burned low. He poured himself another drink, took a deep breath, and rehearsed what he would tell the police if anyone asked. A fight. Too much drinking. She'd stormed out. Maybe she'd gone for a walk and never came back. It was almost perfect. Almost. But as he drove away the next morning, a mile from the cabin, a weak hand clawed through the cold earth back in the woods. A faint gasp broke the still air, ragged, desperate, alive. Claire Ward wasn't gone. Not yet. Cold. That was the first thing she felt. Not pain, not fear, just cold, heavy and suffocating. When Claire Ward's eyes fluttered open, she was surrounded by darkness. Her lungs burned as if she were drowning, her hands clawing upward instinctively. The air was thick, gritty. Soil filled her mouth. Panic exploded inside her chest. She didn't understand where she was, or why she couldn't move. Her mind spun, fragments of sound and memory colliding, a cabin, laughter, gunfire. Ethan's face above her, calm and distant. Then, nothing. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the earth. Her fingers brushed something soft, the edge of a blanket, then leaves, then open air. She pulled herself up with the last of her strength, coughing dirt and blood as she broke through to the surface. The night sky glimmered faintly above her, a hazy stretch of stars blurred by tears and pain. For a long time, she lay there, shaking uncontrollably, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She didn't know how long she'd been buried, hours, maybe longer. Her shoulder throbbed, her body weak and cold. Every movement sent a stabbing ache through her chest, but the will to survive was stronger. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The forest was still, indifferent. The world had gone on without her. She crawled, inch by inch, toward the faint glimmer of moonlight on the lake. Her blood left a trail behind her, dark against the leaves. When she reached the water's edge, she collapsed, her reflection barely recognizable, dirt-smeared skin, wild eyes, lips pale as ash. She cupped water in her trembling hands, washing the blood from her mouth. Then, slowly, the realization came. Ethan had done this. Her husband, the man she'd trusted for 15 years, had tried to kill her. The memory stabbed through the fog of shock, his voice, calm and low, saying, "You should have just let go." Her body trembled violently. Tears mixed with mud on her face, but she kept crawling, forcing herself to stand. She needed help. Someone, anyone. Somewhere down the road, headlights appeared, faint at first, then growing brighter. She stumbled toward them, half-conscious, waving her arms before collapsing again. The sound of tires skidding and a man's voice shouting broke the silence. "Ma'am. Hey. Are you okay? Hey." Then, darkness again. When she woke, it was to the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the faint beeping of hospital machines. Her vision was blurry, but she could make out white walls and the shadow of a nurse moving quickly to her side. "Can you hear me?" the nurse asked softly. "You're safe now. You're at St. Mary's Hospital." Claire tried to speak, but no sound came. Her throat was dry, her lips cracked. The nurse pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. "You were found by a truck driver early this morning near Melrose Lake. You're lucky to be alive." Alive. The word echoed in her mind like something foreign. Over the next few days, she drifted in and out of consciousness. The doctors said she had suffered severe trauma and shock. The bullet wound in her shoulder had missed major arteries by a fraction of an inch. Her body was bruised, dehydrated, and dangerously weak. Her memories were fractured, her mind desperately trying to protect her from the horror it had endured. When detectives tried to question her, she couldn't give them answers. Her name escaped her. Her husband's face came only in flashes, a smile by a fire, a voice saying her name, a shadow in the dark. Every time she tried to recall more, pain seized her head. She became Jane Doe, a survivor with no past. Weeks turned into months. Her physical wounds healed, but her mind remained a puzzle of missing pieces. She moved to a recovery center under a new name, Lena Brooks, the name chosen by the nurse who had saved her. She started drawing again, sketching what she couldn't yet remember, a cabin in the woods, a man's silhouette by the water, a revolver glinting under moonlight. The images came from somewhere deep within, haunting and incomplete. The doctors called it trauma-induced amnesia. Claire called it mercy. Because forgetting meant she didn't have to face the truth, not yet. 2 years had passed since that night in the Tennessee woods. Lena Brooks had built a fragile version of peace, one that depended entirely on forgetting. She now lived in a small apartment above a bookstore in Asheville, North Carolina. Days were quiet, filled with soft music, the smell of paper, and the rhythmic comfort of routine. She worked part-time at a nearby art studio, teaching children how to paint sunsets and lakes, scenes that sometimes, without her realizing it, resembled the one she had escaped. Her colleagues described her as gentle, private, and slightly sad, though she smiled often enough to hide it. At night, however, her calm facade cracked. The dreams came, shadows, muffled voices, the sound of earth being shoveled. She would wake with dirt under her fingernails, though she hadn't been outside. The past was knocking. One stormy evening, as rain streaked across her window, she was sorting through a box of sketches when a small object fell out, a silver locket, tarnished and bent. She didn't remember owning it. Inside was a faded photograph, a man and woman, smiling on a dock by a lake. The man's arm was around her. His eyes were sharp, confident. Hers, hopeful, trusting. A flash of memory hit her like lightning. That smile. That voice. Ethan. Her hand trembled as she whispered the name aloud. The sound felt foreign, yet painfully familiar. Suddenly, the air in the room grew heavy, as if every hidden memory had been waiting for this moment. The dreams grew clearer after that. A cabin. A glass of bourbon. The gun. She began to remember fragments, laughter turning to shouting, a burning pain in her shoulder, the smell of gunpowder. Then the voice, cold and deliberate, "You should have just let go." Her stomach twisted. The man in the photograph wasn't just someone she'd loved. He was the one who had tried to end her life. Claire Ward's identity came flooding back in broken waves, her name, her marriage, her home. But the timeline was a blur. She couldn't remember how she'd survived, how she'd gotten to the road, or who had found her. Only the feeling of betrayal remained, sharp and alive. She couldn't keep living as Lena anymore. The next morning, she took a bus to Nashville, her hands trembling as the city skyline came into view. Every street, every familiar landmark triggered something buried deep inside her. It was both home and nightmare. She didn't go to the police right away. Instead, she walked through her old neighborhood, standing across from the house she once shared with Ethan. The shutters were new, the garden well kept. A small sign near the driveway read, "Ward Financial Group." Her name was gone from the mailbox. But Ethan's wasn't. Through the front window, she saw him, older, broader, his hair flecked with gray. He was laughing with someone, a woman, elegant and younger, holding a glass of wine. Their movements were intimate, practiced. On the wall behind them hung framed photos of business events and smiling clients. No trace of her. No sign that she had ever existed. A cold calm washed over her. He had done it. He had moved on, rebuilt his life on the ashes of hers, the perfect widower, respected and admired, untouchable. But not for long. Claire walked away, her heart pounding. She didn't want revenge. She wanted truth, proof of what he'd done. Proof that she hadn't imagined the grave, the gun, the betrayal. That night, she checked into a small motel on the outskirts of town. She couldn't sleep. Instead, she pulled out a notepad and began writing everything she remembered, the sound of the revolver, the woods, the rain, the feeling of soil covering her skin. It wasn't much, but it was something. By morning, she made her decision. She was going to the police. At the Nashville Metro Precinct, Detective Laura Briggs listened intently as Claire, trembling, voice unsteady, told her story. At first, Briggs was skeptical. People didn't just survive a shooting and a burial. But something about Claire's calm precision, the way she described the terrain and timing, made her pause. Briggs leaned forward. "If what you're saying is true, Mrs. Ward, we'll need evidence. Something that connects him to that night." Claire nodded, her eyes hollow but steady. "I remember where he buried me." The morning air was sharp and silent when they reached the woods near Lake Melrose. Dew clung to the grass, and fog drifted low over the water like a shroud. Detective Laura Briggs followed a few paces behind Claire, her boots crunching over fallen branches. Officers from the Nashville Metro PD and a forensic team trailed close behind, their equipment gleaming under the gray sky. Claire stopped at the edge of a clearing. Her breath came shallow, her hands trembling despite the thick coat she wore. "It was here," she whispered. "Somewhere right here." Briggs studied her closely. "You're sure about this spot?" Claire nodded. "I remember the sound of the water, it was close. And the smell, pine and rain." "He stood over me and said," she stopped herself, swallowing hard. "He thought I was gone." The detective exchanged a glance with the forensic technician, who began marking the area with small yellow flags. They brought in ground-penetrating radar, a standard tool for searches like this. Within minutes, the device beeped softly. Beneath the soil, about 2 feet deep, the screen showed irregular shapes. Briggs crouched beside Claire. "We've got something." Claire's pulse quickened. Her eyes stayed fixed on the earth as the team began digging. The sound of shovels cutting through dirt made her flinch. Every scrape echoed in her bones. Then, a glint of metal. One of the officers called out, "Detective, over here." They unearthed a torn piece of blanket, stiff and stained from years underground. Nearby, a small revolver lay rusted but unmistakable. Inside the blanket were fragments of bone, small, weathered, belonging to an animal. Briggs straightened slowly, her expression unreadable. "He used it," Claire said softly. "He must have tested it first, or tried to cover his tracks." But the real breakthrough came minutes later. As they expanded the search, one officer shouted, "Found something else." Half buried near a tree root was a silver bracelet, delicate, engraved with the initials C.W. Claire's knees gave out. She remembered it instantly, the bracelet Ethan had given her on their 5th anniversary. He'd said, "For the woman who keeps me grounded." Briggs lifted it carefully into an evidence bag. "This alone ties him here." The detective's tone hardened. "We'll get him." Back in Nashville, the forensic results came quickly. The revolver was registered to Ethan Ward, reported stolen by him 2 years earlier. The blanket contained traces of blood matching Claire's DNA profile. Soil samples from her hospital records, taken from her wounds after she was found, matched the mineral composition of the clearing. The case that once sounded unbelievable was now undeniable. Detective Briggs filed for a warrant immediately. When the judge's signature came through, she gathered her team and headed to Ethan's office at Ward Financial Group. The building was sleek and modern, all glass and polished stone, a monument to his success. Inside, Ethan was in the middle of a meeting when the detectives arrived. He stood, confusion flickering across his face before recognition settled in. "Can I help you?" he asked smoothly, glancing between the officers. "Is there some mistake?" Briggs stepped forward, her badge glinting. "Ethan Ward, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Claire Ward." The color drained from his face. For a moment, his composure cracked, then he laughed, a low, disbelieving sound. "My wife? She's dead." "You people." Briggs cut him off. "She's very much alive." The room went still. His eyes darted toward the window, the door, anywhere but her face. Finally, he muttered, "That's impossible." 2 officers stepped forward, reading him his rights as the rest of the office fell silent. His employees watched in stunned disbelief as their polished, respected boss was led away in handcuffs. Outside, Claire waited by an unmarked car. The clouds had started to clear, sunlight breaking through in thin, hesitant rays. When the patrol vehicle pulled up, she looked through the tinted window and saw him, the same man who had once promised her forever. Ethan met her eyes for a brief, flickering moment. There was no remorse there, only disbelief, and anger that his perfect life was crumbling. Briggs placed a reassuring hand on Claire's shoulder. "We've got him. And with the evidence we found, he's not getting out." But Claire didn't smile. The satisfaction she'd imagined wasn't there. Instead, she felt a hollow ache, the echo of a life stolen and buried long before the bullet ever struck. By the time Ethan Ward's trial began, the story had already consumed the news. Headlines called it, "The Woman Who Came Back from the Grave." Talk shows debated it, podcasts dissected it, and strangers whispered about it in cafes. To most, it sounded like fiction, a husband burying his wife alive to protect his money and reputation. But to Claire Ward, it was no story. It was memory, scar, and nightmare rolled into one. The trial opened on a cold February morning at the Davidson County Courthouse. Snow flurries drifted across the steps as reporters crowded outside, their cameras flashing every time someone entered. Inside, the courtroom was tense and hushed. Claire sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her attorney beside her. It had taken months of therapy and courage to face the man who had nearly ended her life. When Ethan entered, wearing a navy suit and that familiar air of control, Claire felt her pulse quicken. He glanced at her briefly, not with remorse, but with the same calculating stare she remembered from their marriage. As if this were just another negotiation. The prosecution began with a chilling reconstruction of the crime. Assistant District Attorney Mark Holden, calm and deliberate, addressed the jury. Ethan Ward didn't make a mistake, he said. He made a plan. A plan to kill his wife, bury her, and walk away a free and wealthy man. He projected crime scene photos onto the courtroom screen, the blanket, the bracelet, the revolver etched with Ethan's initials. Gasps rippled through the audience. Then came the hospital records, proving Claire's wound matched the gun's caliber. The soil samples linked the dirt found in her shoulder wound to the exact clearing where they'd dug up the evidence. Holden's voice softened. He buried her alive. And somehow, she lived. When Claire took the stand, the room fell silent. She spoke calmly, her voice steady but full of pain. She told the jury about the marriage, how Ethan had grown distant, how she tried to save what was left, and how that final weekend was supposed to be a chance to start over. I thought he wanted to fix things, she said quietly. But he wanted to erase me. She described the moment she woke under the soil, the darkness, the cold, the terror. Some jurors looked away, others leaned forward, visibly shaken. Claire's voice trembled only once, when she looked directly at Ethan. You left me there, she said. You thought no one would ever know. Ethan's attorney, a sharp, unflappable man named Gerald Pike, rose for cross-examination. He painted Ethan as a victim of circumstance, a husband whose wife had vanished during a drunken argument, leaving him broken and falsely accused. He suggested that Claire's injuries and memory gaps could have come from an accident, not violence. Mrs. Ward, Pike said with a rehearsed smile, is it possible that your memory, after all this trauma, isn't entirely reliable? Claire met his gaze. I don't remember every detail, she admitted. But I remember enough to know who pulled the trigger. The room was silent. Even Pike faltered before retreating to his table. The defense tried everything, claiming the evidence was circumstantial, arguing that Ethan's gun had been stolen, and suggesting that someone else might have attacked Claire in the woods after she left the cabin. But every theory crumbled under the weight of the forensic reports. The revolver, the DNA on the blanket, the witness statement from the truck driver who'd found her, they all pointed in one direction. On the fourth day of trial, the prosecution called its final witness, Detective Laura Briggs. She spoke with the measured tone of someone who had lived the case for years. We found the weapon. We found the burial site. We found evidence of blood consistent with Mrs. Ward's DNA and fingerprints belonging to the defendant on the same weapon. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. When the defense tried to shake her testimony, Briggs didn't flinch. I've seen hundreds of crime scenes, she said. This wasn't a panicked mistake. It was planned down to the minute. As she stepped down, Ethan's mask began to crack. He whispered furiously to his lawyer, his composure slipping for the first time. The jury watched every twitch, every sneer, every quiet flash of temper that betrayed the calm image he tried to maintain. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned. Claire's heart pounded as she stood in the courtroom, the world narrowing to a single sound, the foreman's voice. We find the defendant, Ethan Ward, guilty of attempted murder in the first degree. Gasps and whispers filled the room. Ethan sat motionless, jaw clenched, his face pale. For the first time, he looked small, stripped of the arrogance that had defined him. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Reporters swarmed as officers led him away in cuffs. Ethan turned once, his eyes locking on Claire's. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he smiled faintly, not with remorse, but with something colder. A silent promise that he would never accept defeat. But it didn't matter anymore. Claire exhaled for the first time in years. The weight she had carried since that night in the woods began to lift, not completely, but enough to breathe again. Justice had been served. Yet as she stepped outside into the winter sunlight, she knew that justice wasn't the same as peace. Spring came late that year, cold mornings, long shadows, and slow sunlight creeping through the trees. But for Claire Ward, it felt like the first true season of her life. It had been 6 months since the verdict. Ethan was serving life in a maximum security prison outside Memphis, and she hadn't heard from him since the sentencing. His appeals had been denied. His empire, the polished firm, the lakeside home, the reputation, had crumbled into dust. Investors pulled out, employees resigned, and his name was quietly erased from every plaque and building he once owned. The man who had tried to bury her was now buried himself, behind bars and concrete. Claire, meanwhile, was learning how to exist again. She kept the name Claire Brooks now, a small merging of who she had been and who she had become. The newspapers had finally stopped calling. The headlines had faded. But she still felt the world's eyes on her sometimes, in the supermarket or on quiet walks near her apartment, when someone recognized her face and whispered, "That's her. The woman who survived." She didn't correct them. She just smiled faintly and kept walking. Every morning, she made tea and sat by the window, sketching the sunrise. The act had become a ritual, one that steadied her when the memories tried to return. Sometimes she drew the forest, sometimes the lake, and sometimes just a single silver bracelet lying in the dirt. Her therapist called it reclaiming the image. Claire called it remembering without breaking. Detective Laura Briggs visited her once in late May, just to check in. They met at a small cafe near the courthouse, a place that smelled of roasted coffee and rain. "You look different," Briggs said with a kind smile. "Better. I feel different," Claire replied. Still waking up some nights, though. Still expecting to see him standing in the doorway. Briggs nodded. "That's normal. But you took your life back. Don't let him live in your head any longer than the law allows." Claire smiled at that. "I won't." One evening, she returned to the place she'd once feared most, Lake Melrose. The trees were taller now, the clearing half reclaimed by moss and weeds. The air smelled of pine and rain, just as it had that night. She stood quietly, listening to the wind move through the branches. This time, it didn't sound like whispers. It sounded like release. She knelt, pressing her hand to the earth. "I made it," she whispered. "You didn't." Then she left a single wildflower on the ground, not for him, but for the woman she had been before everything fell apart. The one who had loved and trusted and nearly died for it. When she walked back toward her car, a calmness settled over her. Not triumph, not vengeance, something deeper. Acceptance. A year later, Claire published a memoir under a pseudonym. It wasn't about murder or revenge, but about survival, about learning to rebuild yourself from the ashes of someone else's cruelty. The book found quiet success. Readers wrote to her about hope, about endurance, about second chances. She never revealed who she really was. She didn't need to. Because the world already knew the story, the perfect drunken spree, the tale of the man who thought he could bury the truth, and the woman who refused to stay dead. In her final chapter, Claire wrote these words. "Some wounds never close. They become part of your map, reminders of where you've been and how far you've crawled. I don't forgive him. But I don't live in his grave anymore. I live." As the sun set over the Tennessee hills, Claire Ward stood on her balcony, a soft wind brushing through her hair. Below, the city lights flickered like fireflies. Somewhere far away, a prison gate clanged shut. And for the first time since that night in the woods, she felt free.